asking him how many ways are there you can spell Bhattacharya. He came up with a number of 57, I think. Yesterday was the 60th anniversary of the passing of Pandit Jawaharlal. Somebody was asking me what it was like at that time. We were up at Kashmir. We flew down as soon as we heard the thing. I was here for the funeral, and the outpouring of grief was so tremendous and so natural, as it were, that it is an unforgettable experience. Lakhs of people gathered, and became something which then was seen all over the world, of course. And I'd like, therefore, to begin by paying my homage to Jawaharlal Nehru, the greatest statesman I think that we have had, and an extraordinary man. Not only his charismatic career as a freedom fighter, he was a charismatic young leader. He spent, I don't know how many years in jail, 7 or 8 years in 13 years in British jails. I mean, coming from a family which was very affluent, and he really was a man who was involved with the whole movement, and with Gandhiji, with Sardar Patel, and all the other great leaders of the freedom movement. But Jawaharlal Nehru's role was unique, not only in the freedom movement itself, where he did play a very distinguished role, but as the he was the one who laid the foundation of modern India. There's no way you can eradicate those facts. Whether it was the framing and passing of the Constitution, which is not him alone, of course. Baba Sahib Ambedkar was the chairman of the committee. But without his constant presence and his ideology, we would not have had the Constitution that we have got. And then his, for example, all the progress we are seeing in our technological developments, the IITs, the IIMs, the outer space programs and all, were all started during his time. And so I think it's very important for us to remember the tremendous contribution made by him, because there seem to be some attempts to denigrate him. I think that is very important, very unfortunate, because it is important for us to cherish our leaders and their memory. I think each succeeding leader should, in fact, cherish the memory of the previous people. If you try and denigrate those memories, I don't think it improves your own status at all. In fact, it gives the impression of being somewhat narrow-minded, somewhat. So, in any case, whatever the government may or may not do, Jawaharlal Nehru will be in our hearts and all. I was certainly corresponding with him, and Penguin has come out with a volume of my correspondence with Jawaharlal. The fact that he should take the trouble to write. I was 18 years old when I started the correspondence, and it lasted for 17 years. And it's extraordinary the time and energy that he took to write. And each one of his letters, by the way, is my dear Tiger. Tiger was my pet name. My father called me Tiger. So his generation people. And I remember I was in Plaster Palace, Paris. I couldn't move very well. When he came to Jammu for the first time, he met my father and left. So I bitterly complained to my father. I said, look, I wanted to meet Panditji because I grew up reading his books. In school, we read The Discovery of India. We read his autobiography. Those were the books that inspired me as a young Indian wanted to get involved in politics. So the next time he came, my father brought him into my room. He said, Tiger, you're a great admirer. said, "No, sir, that's the first time I met." But then, of course, when I came back and when at the age of 18 I became regent, from then right up to his passing away, we became very close. He was my mentor, in fact. He was guru. And I've learned a great deal from him, sitting with him in that drawing room, listening to him talk, having breakfast with him in the morning, and seeing how he always said you must see everything in a historical perspective. He was a great historian also. He said you mustn't look at things only at this point in time. You must look at them in a historical perspective. So it was a great privilege for me, as I said, to be associated as a shishya, not as a colleague, as a shishya. Colleague I was with Indira Gandhi later. With him I was just a disciple. Um, I don't know how many of you, I doubt if there are more than half a dozen of you who were actually here when we came. You'd have to be well over 75 years. Because it is true that we attained our freedom through the extraordinary gist of Mahatma Gandhi, his non-violence and non-violent, non-cooperation and so on. So, but it's also a fact that we paid the freedom in blood and tears as a result of our. Whenever people celebrate freedom and celebrate lakhs of people lost their lives. Millions were relocated in one of the greatest uh, migrations in world history. घर बार सब छोड़ के आए थे, nothing but the shirts on their backs, if they survived. And people must remember what it was like at that time. And I make bold to say, had it not been for Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister, as you know, Churchill said, India is no more a country than the equator. When we leave, it will break into 20 pieces. But here were the people, not only those two, they had a great team, but those were the two main people who held together the ship of state. And we owe them an undying debt of freedom. Because whatever their differences people are trying to pay up, the fact is that they worked very closely. I remember when that Freedom at Midnight speech was given. All of you remember that, but I'm still going to read it out for you just to refresh your memory. I heard it on the radio. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people and to the larger, still larger cause of humanity. What a marvelous speech that was. And you can imagine the thrill that young people like me felt to hear that speech. Well, he was chosen, Gandhiji's unerring instinct, chosen as the new Prime Minister. I mean, the Congress Party committees, I think, were much more in favor of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was the senior organization man. But Gandhiji had his own instinct. He knew who was it who could take India into the modern age. And Sardar, of course, was a great man, and his contribution to consolidating India will always be remembered. He was the one really who consolidated India politically and physically, but he lasted only two and a half years. He passed away in December 1950. Jawaharlal went on and was able to lay the foundation of. Now, there were multiple problems in partition. There were problems of administration. The IAS was there, and Sardar Patel was very firm. There was some uh, socialistic, shall we say, demand that we must abolish the IAS and these are just brown sahibs and all. Sardar Patel said nothing doing. Without an administrative service, we cannot keep this. He put down his foot and the administrative service was more or less stabilized for that time. The second was the armed forces. They had to be partitioned. People don't realize that the Indian army was an integrated force. It had fought for 200 years around the world. Now it had to be bifurcated. I think that was done largely by Mountbatten, because Mountbatten was very much of a military man. I think he probably organized that quite peacefully. The third, the foreign service. The foreign service had to be actually reinvented because, I mean, there were some great people like Sir Geja Shankar Bajpai, who was our representative in the United Nations even before India became independent. But from Indian princes, from independent intellectuals, from social stalwarts. And he journalists also, indeed, you're right to say. And so he was able to really create a new service. I mean, the Indian Foreign Service as it is today is a creation of Jawaharlal Nehru. I think we should have no hesitation in saying that. And that is where Professor Bhattacharya's book becomes so significant.
Actually, not a professor, I'm just a journalist.
All right, a journalist.
Professor is here.
Well, I have given you an honorary degree. I've been chancellor of so many universities. I can give you an honorary degree. You with JNU, JNK University. Sorry, Bhattacharya. You've written a very professional book. That's why I called you professor. And he's done a lot of research, I must say. I have not read the whole book. He let me just tweak a book and said he wanted me to release it. And so he's written this very interesting book. And he's mentioned a lot of people, including my good friend Natwar Singh and Vijay Lakshmi, Auntie Nan, as we called her, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. And I knew many of the people there. Some of my class fellows in Doon School entered the Foreign Service. Ashok Gokhale, KPS Menon Jr., both were my classmates. We graduated the same year in 1945. Graduated as in the senior Cambridge. And our English teacher, surprisingly, Sri V. Siddharthachari, also joined the Foreign Service. And was there. He was the only member in good school as an outstanding teacher and intellectual. And then there were all these princes who Patiala. There were many people whom I knew. So they between them, they formed this new service. And interestingly, from the time from 1950, I think, whenever the Foreign Service people used to do the training and used to do their visit to Kashmir, one thing that was always put into the program was tea with the Sadr Riyasat. So all these people whom I now meet around the world say, we had tea with you back in 1951 or 1953. So I had the pleasure of meeting them all. And also, I must say, in my 6 years, 8 years as Indian representative on the board of UNESCO, uh, I came across a lot of very able foreign affairs officers. And even more, 9 years that I was president of the ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, was in a way an offshoot of the ministry, but was set up separately. And in those 9 years, I worked very closely with the ambassador because wherever we opened a cultural center, we had to have the cooperation of the ambassador concerned. And I had opened as many as 40 cultural centers around the world. So in each one of those centers, not only was I in touch with them, I visited most of them, met the ambassadors, and there's a lot of contribution from the External Affairs Ministry for the ICC. But apart from that, I won't take too much time. I was given only 10 minutes. I don't know how many I've taken. But I must tell you, I narrowly missed money. I don't know whether you know this or not. I narrowly missed a full-time diplomatic career. In 1946, when I was just 35, Lal Bahadur Shastri was Prime Minister. L.K. Jha, his principal private secretary, met me and conveyed to me the message that he would like to appoint me as High Commissioner to the UK. Now, it was a tempting offer, but by that time, the political bug had already bitten me. Although I was not in politics yet, but I was keen to get into national politics. I didn't want to, I had done this sort of as if a ceremonial post for many, many years. I thought I cannot get into another post of that nature. So I very gracefully declined. Had I accepted that, the rest of my life would have been as a diplomat. So I narrowly missed that. However, as I said, I had many, many interesting experiences. Bulgarian and Khrushchev were at a party which Panditji gave. And when I was introduced, I said casually, Your Excellency, you should visit Jammu and Kashmir. I had no idea. 4 days later, Panditji received your invitation. I said, what invitation? I said, so anyhow, they came. It was a very historic visit. We flew up to Kashmir. It was at my party, my farewell party, that he said, if you ever need us, just come to these mountains and call. We are here. And that was when the Soviet Union clearly spelled out its attitude on the Kashmir issue. So that was my brush with and I had also, when I was with Mrs. Gandhi, I was Minister of Waiting to several people, including the Shah of Iran, who was a very impressive man, including Baudouin of Belgium, including Field Marshal Tito. And I'll tell you something about Tito. We were traveling around the country and we were in Kanha. At that time, shooting was allowed. I said, Mr. President, Mr. Chen said, I am not for the animals, not for you. You go and shoot. Came back and said, you must have been praying for the animals because we never got anything to talk. So then in the course of the conversation, I said, sir, as a student of political science, can I ask you a question? He said, yes, go ahead. That you made a new constitution which allows for secession. Do you think that after you go, the Yugoslavia will continue? Do you know what he said to me? He said to me, Mr. Minister, if after I go the states want to break, let them break. Extraordinary thing to say, but he was the creator of that state. It's very clear that he realized that in fact, and it broke in a very, very ugly manner. Anyhow, so I've had many of these things. Then when I was with Mrs. Gandhi's government, I had some very interesting special assignments. I went to when centenary of Gandhiji is coming back, 1993, to South Africa. That's where I met Nelson Mandela, who had just been released from jail. A remarkable man. not a trace of bitterness in him. I was absolutely astounded to meet with him. And then I went to Turkey for the 50th anniversary of Kemal Atatürk. And I was one of the few people in the world who walked from Asia to Europe, because that Bosphorus bridge was opened on that occasion. And many other such interesting things, finally ending up with what is considered to be the crown of the Foreign Service, ambassador 6 months.
Very much, Dr. Singh. It was a pleasure listening to your anecdotes. And now, congratulate Kallur for his book and tell us about something about the book. You have 10 minutes. Kallur.
Well, thank you so much for saying it was really given very wide historical sweep for the book and so your own experience of Nehru era. Um, and I'm really grateful to Manishankar Iyer ji and Professor Purushottam Agrawal and to the FCC for hosting this event as we launch Nehru's first recruits just a day after the 60th anniversary of the passing of Jawaharlal Nehru. Dr. Singh, sir, you mentioned the name of KPS Menon Jr. And my book actually is framed around the first official directory of the IFS, Indian Foreign Service, that was edited by KPS Menon Jr. in 1959. It was the first official directory, and it came at a particular time in history when perhaps after a decade of creative phase of Nehru's diplomacy, kind of an in-house document was desired, and the decision was taken to write down the names of all the officials who were hired in those previous decade. So that special book that is titled The History of Services of the Officers of the Indian Foreign Service, A and Branch A and Branch B, is where the inspiration of my book lies. It began sometime in 1946, October, when the Indian Foreign Service became sort of, took roots, and then quickly evolved during the next 2 years, and finally, of course, over the next 10 years, approximately 401 or 404 Indian officials were recruited and hired from all walks of life. And from not having any foreign service worth its name, in 10 years' time, we had a full-fledged Indian Foreign Service for the first time in the history of India. And what's most fascinating is that the decision and the implementation was taken in a way which did not really say much about the overarching vision, but some sort of a progressive commitment, to have a kind of a dedicated wing or a branch of foreign service for the Indian state, which took charge in 1947 August. It is actually around that time that all these people came in, and they came in from various walks of life. For example, they were the ICS officers who were the veterans, and then there were the new recruits called the competition walas, as they were called at that time. And that apart, there were also the irregulars who came, like the princes and the rebels and fighters who had fought the British forces, including the comrades of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. So all these people came in at a time and created a service which more or less began in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, but then they covered the historical sweep of the early 20th century till the 21st century, because many of these people, including the ones that, sir, you mentioned just now, actually continued to serve in the government, like, for example, Mr. Brajesh Mishra, K. Natwar Singh, and Chinmaya Gare Khan. They all were in public life till around 2009 and 2010. Brajesh Mishra passed away a little bit after that. But then overall, these individuals who who we actually could see from the first page of the history of services were like KPS Menon Senior and R.K. Nehru, as well as Subimal Dutt, Rajeshwar Dayal, and many others, to the very young recruits like Meera Ishad Das Malik, whose daughter Namita Sinha is with us here. And then we have Indiva Kamtekar, the historian, whose father Dilip Kamtekar was also one of the direct recruits, the early recruits in the Indian Foreign Service. So all these people came in and they created this service, which then continued to work for the next few decades. So this entire historic sweep, around 90 odd years, is a very fascinating period of Indian diplomatic history and Indian diplomacy. So I felt when I looked at the directory, I felt that it was not just a directory full of names and career details, but a directory full of life and full of interesting events and characters and developments that need to be chronicled. And that is how the research into the book began, and all my interviews and all those activities that went through during the very difficult period of pandemic. I simply couldn't have done this without the brilliant team from HarperCollins, my editor Swati Chopra and also Anju Christine. They were very, very helpful during the last 3 years, and they helped me deal with the process of editing and etc. But then the research itself was very interesting and a great learning process, because I got the rare support of the four of the direct recruits, like Mr. K. Natwar Singh, Eric Gonzalez, Maharaja Krishna Rasgotra, and of course Mr. Chinmay Gare Khan, who now lives in New York. And these individuals, they not only inspired me and motivated me, but also gave me the overarching focus, which is necessary to remember the rich origins of the Indian Foreign Service. I hope that those of you who are here will go around and talk about this book more, and so that the legacy that lives on even today is taken further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kallol. May I now invite Professor Agrawal?
Thank you, Venkatji. Dr. Singh, friends on the podium and in the audience. I congratulate Kallol for penning down this book, which through some sketches and some impressions of the lives of diplomats, presents before us a picture of the making of significant part of Indian state, that is Indian Foreign Service. I am not an expert on foreign affairs. I have never been journalist in my life, and I have never been a student of international studies at the JNU where Dr. Saab was chancellor. I was not a student of international studies, but I have been interested in Nehru for quite some time, and that is the only reason that I have been invited here and I have agreed to come. And therefore, I would just like to point out as briefly as possible two basic points towards which this book directly and indirectly takes our attention, and which we should keep in mind while reading this book or while assessing Nehru in any aspect of his policies and his acts. Nehru was obviously the product of national movement for Indian freedom, which was, if not unique, then very special, at least in two ways. Our national movement was not only for political freedom, it also had a very strong component of self-criticism. It was not critical only of British imperialism and exploitation associated with it. It was, for example, very critical of Indian traditions and practices themselves, for example, in matters of caste prejudices, communal tensions, and many other things. Let us not forget that for Gandhiji and his colleagues like Sardar Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, the so-called Rachnatmak Karikram or constructive program was as much a part of politics as was the agitation. So this part, this I describe as self-critical component of Indian freedom movement. Second was, and in this sense, Nehru I think was the most suited person to be the first Prime Minister of India. I think amongst all our leaders, he realized very deeply the gist of Indian tradition, and that is looking for enlightened middle way and discarding the very natural temptation of extremes. Extremes are very tempting. In our youth, we all want to burn the unjust social order or to destroy whatever we dislike. We all want a fresh beginning, but the experience of life teaches us that there cannot be a fresh beginning. And Nehru, it's important for us to realize that Nehru tried to implement this in domestic as well as in foreign policies. And that is why in domestic policy also, he was criticized for mixed economy. He was criticized by some for not being nationalist enough, by some for not being revolutionary enough, by some for not being traditionalist enough, or by some for not being modernist enough. This was this understanding of India's uniqueness and the legacy of Indian freedom movement that I think went into the thinking of foreign affairs so far as Nehru is concerned. The second important aspect of our national movement was a consciousness of the international environment right from the beginning. I mean, I am so this fact that Indian freedom cannot be anything by itself, it has to be a part of a global process. And this is something which Nehru put very eloquently and categorically at the end of, while concluding his discovery of India in 1946, that India has a destiny, India has a role to play in the world affairs. And this role cannot be just a role on the margins. India has to play a leading role in its own way. And that is why the kind of foreign policy he was imagining would not have been possible without a very conscious attempt of maintaining the continuity in some way or the other with the past. At the same time, the innovations were also required. Therefore, you had these ICS officers working as diplomats, but at the same time, you had journalists, radio persons, academics joining or being invited to join the Ministry of External Affairs. And it was through one encounter with such a person that in a subconscious way, the entire concern of Nehru comes out in the play. Kallol has mentioned Bachchan, Harivansh Rai Bachchan, the eminent Hindi poet who was invited by Nehru to join Ministry of External Affairs as not exactly translator, but as in charge of making the official language work or the work of Hindi more systematic and proper in the ministry. And Bachchan was working in that capacity. So once Bachchan was asked to translate the presidential speech in Hindi, which the president was supposed to deliver in English. Radhakrishnan was president, and Vice President Zakir Hussain was supposed to read out the Hindi translation. That is the practice which continues till today. So Bachchan translated that speech, and Nehru was furious. As Kallol writes, that it was first opportunity for Bachchan to encounter the famous Nehruian temper. Nehru got very angry with that translation. Reason being that Bachchan had translated, rightly so, in a proper literary Hindi, not in that Sarkari Hindi which we all talk of, proper literary Hindi. Nehru's point was that Zakir Hussain cannot pronounce this kind of thing. And it will be a scandalous situation that the Vice President of the Republic is not able to read a speech in national language or official language of the Union properly to the House of Parliament. Therefore, this translation has to be changed. Bachchan had his own point. He was speaking from the point of view of integrity of language, not compromising the basic character of Hindi language and all that. But Nehru was insistent, and it was in this context that he uttered a sentence which Kallol has quoted obviously from some. I think it is quoted from Bachchan's Atmakatha only. No, I have the number. I just want to read it as it is. Yes. So, Nehru told Bachchan, while Bachchan was arguing that Zakir Hussain should read this, he can practice for a while, somebody can help him practicing to properly speak this or to read out this literary Hindi. Nehru lost patience. And he told Bachchan, you see, there is enough trouble in the country already. Don't add to that. Don't force Zakir Hussain to read a speech which he might not read properly and then invite kind of criticism, sarcasm or ridicule or whatever. The point which I draw from this simple anecdote that the man constantly had the consciousness of India having a lot of troubles in every sphere of life. I mean, ordinarily speaking, it is a simple matter. A translation has to be read by the Vice President, a adding to the troubles. That has been the greatest tragedy of Indian democracy, I think, since the death of Nehru. In such a context, the publication of this book, which is apparently about a particular part of the administration, that is diplomats, foreign service, but the book also gives us a lot of insight into the way Nehru looked at world and also at his priorities and governance. Thank you, Kallol, for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal. May I now invite Mani Shankar Iyer.
Dr. Karan Singh, other members of this podium, and my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be here on the occasion of the release of this book on Nehru's first recruits, because I was literally Nehru's last recruit. The story, I believe, is worth sharing with you. In October 1962, the Chinese allegedly invaded India. On the day that Tawang fell, the Foreign Service exams began in London. When they were over, I was the newspaper, I was prominent in the politics of Cambridge Union. And so the newspapers used to make references to me as being very left-wing, as being a communist. So after I had passed the Foreign Service exam, and I'd done rather well, if I may say so, I suddenly found that I was not getting any kind of admission letter. So I wrote to the Ministry of External Affairs saying I haven't received my joining letter, as it was called. And in reply, I got a telegram. I was still in Europe. I got a telegram saying, regret to inform you that you have been rejected from all services. And I immediately realized what it was about. The Intelligence Bureau had a very important source of information on Indian students studying at foreign universities. It was the newspapers, especially the yellow rags. And so the Intelligence Bureau, and I'm not quite sure why it's called that, because it seems to be the one quality they lack. They read these newspapers and came to the conclusion that as I was a communist, and as some people said that I had raised money for the Chinese, I wasn't able to raise money to eat my dinner. How was I going to raise it for the Chinese? But anyway, I was removed from the list. I rushed back to India, and then a series of interviews took place. Particularly, my patron was a gentleman who's referred to here, Rajeshwar Dayal. When I met him to say that I had been kept out of the Foreign Service for being a dangerous red, he replied to me that he had been married to the daughter of the richest industrialist in Uttar Pradesh, and that had made him a communist for life. And he added that when he was at Oxford, he always had a pink card on his mantelpiece. So thanks to him, and thanks to several others who enabled me to meet the President of India, the two Home Ministers, and various civil servants. The whole story is recounted in my memoirs, and I think bears reading there. Eventually, the Home Minister overruled the Intelligence Bureau and suggested that I be taken into the Foreign Service. And I have been able, as a minister, to have a look at my file, which is otherwise confidential. I don't see what there is confidential about a paper that is now 60 years old. But I was allowed to look at it as a cabinet minister. And I found the entry which read, I too, he said, I agree. I too have heard good reports of Mani Shankaraya. He may be taken into the Indian Foreign Service and sent to Missouri for his training. Signed, Jawaharlal Nehru, 23rd October 1964, 63. So that is how I became Nehru's last recruit into the Foreign Service. And since I was the last recruit, it's hardly surprising that I do not figure in Kalol's book. This is a very reverential book. It treats our first recruits with a great deal of respect, a great deal of honor, a certain amount of awe. But that's because he has the advantage, the author, of looking at people who are long dead. It was the fate of the second generation of Foreign Service officers that included me to have to serve under Nehru's first recruits. And there are at least 2 or 3 names here, which I read in dread. The only comfort I got from that was that in Seminar magazine, in the early 80s, there was an excellent line, which I think Kalol should have incorporated in his book. The writer in Seminar magazine said that the Foreign Service was initially constituted by dispossessed princelings, illiterate cavalrymen, and well-connected nitwits. And anybody of my generation could name to you which officers fell in which of these 3 categories. And many of these people he treats with a reverence which I find extremely difficult to follow. One of them, who's mentioned here, and maybe I shouldn't mention his name, was my ambassador in Baghdad. And Kalol talks of him in terms which made me hardly recognize this man. Because my first quarrel with him, when he came to Baghdad as my ambassador, was when he invited me with great pride to attend a dinner party in his home, where he was getting the wife of some prominent Iraqi politician as his chief guest. And he talked of her in terms that were as reverential as Kalol talks of this gentleman. So I went to the dinner and I found myself seated at a large circular brass table. And this lady was immediately opposite me. But across the entire diameter of the brass table, which was at least 2 arms long. So she reached for a bowl of cashew nuts. And I, being a trained Foreign Service officer, immediately reached for that bowl to pick it up and give it to her. But the ambassador was quicker on the draw than I was. So his hand reached the bowl before my hand did. And he picked up the bowl and he gave it to the lady, who gratefully accepted the cashew nuts. And I retired defeated. But about 4 months later, this gentleman says to me, "How dare you? You made me serve the cashew nuts to the lady." So I said, "But sir, I tried to get there, but you were quicker than me." And he said, "That is not acceptable to me." And he went on to write an annual confidential report on me, which had an adverse comment in every single column except for the date of birth. He wasn't able to write an adverse comment on my date of birth. So this character's ACR was then not shown to me, which it should have been. It was simply sent to the Ministry of External Affairs, where the Foreign Secretary, who is also mentioned in this book, a wonderful man called Ram Sati, gave it to another wonderful man called Romesh Bhandari. And Romesh Bhandari recommended that this gentleman, who is talked of in the highest terms by Kalol, that it should be burnt. So there's no copy of that left, but the copy of my reply I have with me, and so I've been able to refer to it. So there are very curious characters who are here, including another ambassador whom he doesn't mention, but belongs to your fraternity. He was a very, very famous journalist. And Indira Gandhi decided to send him to Hanoi as our ambassador to Hanoi, except that she didn't have the guts to call him the ambassador because the United States had passed the Battle Act. And under the Battle Act, any country having diplomatic relations with North Vietnam was going to be sanctioned, and we were living ship to mouth on PL 480 shipments. So she said that he would be the consul general with the personal rank of ambassador. And she wrote a letter to Ho Chi Minh, who I find is honored on these walls, to Ho Chi Minh saying that I'm sending so-and-so to you, and he is an ambassador masquerading as a consul general. Now the Vietnamese were fighting a life or death battle in that time. This was the year of our Lord 1968. They had just been through the Tet Offensive. The war was turning in their favor, not because of anything they were doing, but because American students had come out on the campuses in the way in which they are now out on the campuses. And I salute my friend from Syria in favor of the Palestinians. And they were therefore not going to give in to these ridiculous things of an ambassador being posted as a consul general and being asked to give a letter to Ho Chi Minh that would describe him as an ambassador. So the North Vietnamese simply said, you can give your letter to Ho Chi Minh to the head of the Asia desk, but you won't be allowed to meet Ho Chi Minh. And I got posted as his deputy in Hanoi just at this time when the Vietnamese were putting this gentleman in his place. So he needed somebody to kick. As they say, if a boss shouts at his deputy, the deputy then shouts at his assistant, the assistant then shouts at the office boy, and the office boy kicks the office cat. So I was in that position that he vented all his spleen on me. And then the crisis came when we were taken on a picnic together with him and his wife, who's a lovely woman, but with whom he was constantly quarreling. And the lady, she was Scottish, and she was full of humor. She was rather well endowed. And so she would say, she'd quite happily say that when she went into a pub in Scotland, then somebody or the other would call out, here comes Mary bringing in the milk. And while he was very small and very, very nasty and always full of anger. And his great hero was V.K. Krishna Menon. So he was trying to imitate Krishna Menon without having any of the qualities, the great qualities that Krishna Menon had. So on this picnic, Mary offered to give us lunch after an entire day of trekking. And my mother was with me, she was over 50 years old. So she asked him and he said, no, he didn't want anything from the picnic basket. And then she asked me, she said, are you hungry? I said, yes. And I was particularly thinking of my mother. So she gave us some biscuits. Next day, this man calls me in and says, how dare you eat my biscuits without my permission? So I was 27 years old. I was in this strange, weird country called Vietnam, where we weren't allowed to interact with any locals. So I went out to the Petit Lac, which has a large lawn around it, and I sat on a wooden bench and I cried. And thereafter, every time I went to Hanoi, whether it was with the foreign minister or with the prime minister, I would force the entire delegation to go on foot to that wooden bench and pay their obeisance to it. It was my hope that after I became a prominent Indian, the Indian government would take over that bench, and like they have done at Peter Maritzburg, they would make it a national monument. Unfortunately, these Vietnamese, who have betrayed us by becoming the best friends of the Americans, have demonstrated their friendship for the Americans by dismantling the wooden bench and putting in its place a steel bench, which is not where I cried. So we had characters like that as well. The ICS was the complement to these dispossessed princelings, illiterate cavalrymen, and well-connected nitwits who joined the service. It was the ICS. Nehru had scathingly said of them during the freedom movement that they were neither Indian, nor civil, nor even a service. And yet he had the wisdom to find that these were opportunistic young men, but patriotic young men. And that we would need the ICS, not as a steel frame, but as a somewhat rusted iron frame, to be able to build upon with what I regard as a second generation of genuine foreign service officers. We were the competition wallahs. And I think we added several dimensions to foreign diplomacy, including economic diplomacy. And I would hope that Kalol will supplement his first recruits with the last recruit and his followers. That will give a rounded picture of where the Foreign Service stands. Otherwise, I'll have to leave you with one of my favorite stories of an ICS wife. He figures very largely in this book. I'm going to leave you to find out who it was. But his wife was rather homespun. And when they were posted in America, I'm not going to tell you whether they were posted in the embassy in Washington, in the consulate in San Francisco, or in the permanent mission in New York. But when they were posted there, her driver fell ill. And she, being a woman of some compassion, she saw to it that her driver was put into hospital. And when she fetched up at that hospital to inquire after her chauffeur's health, the doctor on duty said, "Who are you? Are you his wife?" And she was infuriated. So she drew herself up to her 5'6" and said, "I'm not his wife, I'm his mistress." So if Kalol is ready to write an irreverential companion volume to this book, I'd be more than happy to collaborate. But for the moment, I must say that the only really delightful memory that this book evoked in me was a prince called Kotda Sangi, whose kingdom was the size of a postage stamp in Saurashtra. He was one of those whom Nehru had recruited, and it was from his Kar Kamal that I received my first passport to go to Cambridge. The others are there, they're here. Some of them are really super people. Many of them, or some of them anyway, I wouldn't place in the first category of human beings. But nevertheless, for having introduced the subject, which is otherwise a pretty dead letter, almost as dead as the history of services, and for having highlighted some of the great ones, like Sumal Sinha, who was our Consul General in Lhasa, our last Consul General in Lhasa, and our greatest expert on China, and his married a Foreign Service lady whose first choice was the Chinese language. And Nehru, looking at her, said, "But won't your mother come after me with a stick and say to me, 'How have you sent my daughter to Beijing?' when there are places like London that you could be sent to." The Foreign Service has fortunately got out of that rather traditionalist rut in which we were when we started, when brilliant women were simply removed from the service because of the sin they committed in marrying. As soon as they married, they had to leave. And they were not allowed to go to what were called difficult posts until one lady, whom I would have been delighted to get married to, except that she was that much older than me, C.V. Muttama, she managed to break this mold and got herself posted to Ghana. But unfortunately for her, as she was stepping out of a Ghana Airlines flight, the ramp had not been properly fixed and she fell to the ground and she really had a very difficult time. And so while we had these marvelous women, Surjit Mansingh, whom you haven't mentioned, the eccentric Rukmini Menon, who I think is well worth a book, leave alone a chapter. There are others whom we, I think, should pay respects to. There was a dinner party in my house when Bhaswati Mukherjee had been invited, and all of them, all the men, were talking about gender discrimination against women, and she stood up and said, "I'm from the Foreign Service. I served in it for 36 years. This is, of course, the third generation." She said, "I served in it for 36 years, and there was not 1 minute of discrimination which I suffered." So I think our Foreign Service has also grown beyond Nehru. Apart from being based almost entirely on Nehru, the foreign policy of India, the foreign service has grown beyond the prejudices to which his generation was subject. And today, when you look at, you can't read the news these days because every front page and now increasingly every inside page has photographs of all those who passed the Foreign Service exam or passed the IAS exam. And I keep looking at the number 7 to see who is my spiritual successor. In this batch, it's a lady called Anmol Rathore. And I find that she's far from alone, as C.B. Muttama was in 1948. About half, and I suspect that if I counted carefully, more than half the recruits into the Foreign Service are now women. They're allowed to get married. They're allowed even to marry foreigners. And the Foreign Service itself, where men had to retire if they married somebody from abroad. And one of my batchmates, Siva Kumar Das, was shunted out to the UNDP because he married a Czech girl. I think all those bad features of the first generation of recruits has now been overcome, and we have a much more gender equal foreign service. I want to end by saying that when the Mandal Commission report was tabled by VP Singh in Parliament, and I had my reservations about implementing it, the same reservations that Nehru had, that Indira Gandhi had, that Rajiv Gandhi was having. Dhawan asked me a question. He said, how many OBCs are in the IFS? I had no idea, but I looked up the same book, The History of Services, which is an annual edition, and tried to identify how many Yadavs there were in the Foreign Service. There were none. Then I looked at the IFSB, and I couldn't find any Yadavs. Now I know that Yadavs are not the only OBCs, but it's a giveaway. So then I looked at the IFSC, and there I found that there were Yadavs. So it was clear that up to my generation and even into the 20th century, or even into the 21st century, the it was an upper class and an upper caste service. It was a service made up of Mokhole ki Aulad. And now is becoming more democratic, and it has a lot of Hindi speakers. And I was very impressed on a visit that I once was making to Istanbul to find that a new recruit could only speak to me in Hindi. But by the time I reached Istanbul again the following year, the same gentleman spoke fluent English and, more importantly, fluent Turkish. So we are getting the flavor of our country into the Foreign Service, and that, I think, is a very good thing. Thank you very much.
Now we have question and answer session. Those of you who have a question, kindly raise your hand and identify yourself and say who the question is meant for, and then, yeah. Subhash? Hold on. Just take the microphone.
A brilliant speak like always, Mr. Mani Shankaraya. But I did not understand one of your first sentence when you said the Chinese alleged invasion of India. Was it an alleged invasion or was it an actual invasion?
Well, you brought me to a very controversial point. There are various books which indicate that we could have accepted Zhou Enlai's proposal of April 1960. We could have perhaps avoided war by backing up our forward policy with adequate military military strength to be able to open those forward posts. And you will recall that Nehru had said that I ordered the Indian Army to throw out the Chinese from the Thakla Ridge. And there was a kind of riposte that came from the Chinese. So I used the expression alleged, but I shouldn't have done so.
Yes, it is an
I shouldn't have done so because we're in the middle of an election.
No, apart from that, it was historically and factually.
There
an
was, yeah.
invention. They have taken over. Our
I
land,
agree with you.
and we are still fighting for it.
I agree with you.
About to be quoted in the last phase of the election.
Any other questions? Yes, Ganesh? Yeah. Use the microphone, please.
Mr. Bhattacharya, since you have written about the first generation of the foreign service officers, I believe a lot of advice about China given by those diplomats, first generation diplomats, was ignored by the government of the time. Have you written about that? Since I have not read the book, so I just want to know about that. They had warned about China. They had warned against China, those diplomats, first generation diplomats.
Right. I guess, I've written about the fact that the structure of foreign policy professionals, even in the mid 1950s, was not really formal. There were lots of, there is a lot of loose, lot of informality that existed even in the formal structure back at that time. So these communications and they used to get lost, and also most importantly, all our posts in various locations were not yet ready. A decade had passed, but then the Indian missions were not yet fully manned, and in many places the missions were just coming up. And the problem with China was first of all, very unique, because it was basically the end of innocence for not just the Nehru administration, but also end of innocence for the post-colonial state of India, that there were threats from nearer home, like not just colonial threats and things like that, but that even your compatriots in the Asian continent could also pose security threats. So in that way, these were very new things for the administrators who were at that time on the top positions. But I'm sure, as you said, that whether there were any shortcomings in the advice, but if you look at the people who were posted in the mid 1950s and then late 1950s in Beijing, they were first-rate Chinese speakers. They were professionals who came from the finest colleges and universities. So in that way, at least in the qualitative term, there was no compromise. So there was Sumal Sinha, there was K.M. Kannampilli, and GP, the great G. Parthasarathy was our ambassador right before the conflict broke out. So they were first-rate professionals. So, though the team was very small, and there can be always debate and discussion about whether certain communications were neglected and etc. But I would say that though small, they were capable of delivering in difficult circumstances.
Yes, please.
Good evening, Dr. Karan Singh, sir. Compliments to your age, almost age of my father, and he always talks about you. I represent the aviation fraternity. I am from the aviation GS Baba. And aviation is dear to us. Dr. Goyal is there. And sir, I always had a question in my mind. I wanted to ask you in person. You had brought aviation and tourism in this part of the world. And today, whatever we are, there are the foundation laid by you. At that time, aviation and tourism used to be together. And we talked that Rahul Gandhi brought something, Rajiv Gandhi brought something. Everybody brings something to contribute to the national infrastructure building. What was Nehru's vision about the aviation and tourism and aviation having separated later on? Do you feel that there was a synergy which we are missing? And what was Nehru's vision on aviation and tourism about this country? Are we on that track? Sorry to take you back to the history.
Of course, I became aviation minister in 1967, which was 3 years after he had passed away. I cannot say what exactly his vision was about aviation. He always talked about the importance of communications. He always talked about the importance of being able to go around the world. He was an internationalist in the best sense of that term. And obviously he was also then, therefore, involved in aviation. But I am sorry, I cannot actually quote any particular point about aviation for Panditji. But you're right, aviation used to be part of shipping and tourism. So it was the first time when I joined Mrs. Gandhi's cabinet, shipping and transport were bifurcated. They made a separate ministry under Professor V.K.R.V. Rao, and tourism and civilization for the first time became a separate ministry under me. And I do feel that the importance of them being together is tremendous. Because you cannot have the one without the other. Unfortunately, again and again they've been bifurcated. I'm not quite sure what the position is now. But I know that Jyotiraditya Sindha is only Minister for Aviation, not for tourism. They're two separate. So I think it's a pity because one of the first things, for example, that I did was I discovered that Air India had 30 offices around the world. Tourism had 4 offices around the world. So first thing to do was to merge the offices, at least use the Air India offices for tourism. It was an obvious thing to do. But as you know, in the government of India, to get two different departments to work with each other, even if they're in the same ministry, is virtually a miracle. It took me 2 or 3 years of hammering, and finally we did that. So I agree with you, they should be together, and I hope that whichever government comes into effect next week will bring them together again.
Thank you.
The book is available at a special rate outside. Alon will be very happy to autograph the book. May I now invite Simran to propose the vote.
From all of us here at the Foreign Correspondents Club, a big thank you to Dr. Karan Singh, Alon, Professor Agrawal, and Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer for coming here this evening. This has been a wonderful discussion, and it has been streamed live on the FCC Facebook and the formerly Twitter, that is the X page. A recording of the discussion will also be available in the archives section of the FCC Facebook page in case anyone wants to go back and listen to the discussion again. And a small request, if anyone is doing a report, please do mention that the interaction took place at the FCC today. Once again, thank you so much from all of us. Thank you.
May I invite Simran to present mementos to our distinguished guests, please.